Welcome to this channel. So, more likely, if you're watching this, you've probably seen some of my other videos, potentially on other channels. Now, of course, I do want to introduce myself. I am, of course, Belle, and I am Jacqueline too. We're Pearl. Not really much to, not really much to really talk about. But of course, this is going to be similar to my late night with the Moth Queen videos, where I will pick a random topic and I will, of course, discuss it. Now, of course, the topics that I will cover in these more likely would be different other vid- compared to other videos. So, obviously, do be one that these might not really have as much these might not really have as much you know of a common theme with them, but of course I want to talk about this topic. So of course, welcome to the first episode of Belle Mab's The Witching Hour. And of course, the topic today is of course horror and how it influenced media. Now of course I'm most likely going to be talking about games, and I will, of course, talk about some movies and books. So the question is, what is horror? Well, horror is it's a very um diverse genre. There's many types of it. I mean, you got slashers with Freddy and Jason, Michael, Leatherface. You got psychological, you know, um, you got uh, torture. You got, fake documentaries and like found footage and fillers. Horror can be done in any number of ways to induce emotion from its viewers. And of course, that is the point of horror, is to scare people. Now, some horror does actually do something more than that, as it focuses on something else, as it wants to tell a particular story. Some, might provide social commentary. A common example of this was, of course, John Romero's Night of the Living Dead. As, you know, according to quite a few people, there was, of course, you know, there was, of course, some parts of that movie that did provide some social commentary on stuff that was going on at the time. And you also have the same thing with 28 days later and uh 28 weeks later, you know as the first movie was kind of, I don't remember exactly what it was trying to reference, but it was providing commentary on something. And sometimes you just have movies that just really want to show a high blood count, like Halloween. I mean, you could dive deeper into that and be like, yeah, maybe Lois survived because she was a virgin or a babysitter. But no, Lori survived because Lori, generally did what she was supposed to. But then you have stuff like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which again does provide more social commentary, and it's just, honestly, there's not much I can really say about that movie without making it take up the entire time. But of course, horror as a genre can be done in multiple ways. And so, how can horror be influential? Well, I'll definitely say so. You know, horror can influence other stuff. I mean, for instance, Halloween was influenced by Psycho, and Psycho was influenced by a actual real life crime, that of course being the crimes of Ed Gein. I won't really get into too much of all of this, but basically what happened is that this guy, he was definitely insane, and he he was basically digging up corpses. And when news about this kind of ended up reaching to outside sources, it influenced stuff like Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and of course the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because really not ever once did people really here's something in this. This was something completely out of the blue, and being knowledgeable about this, yeah, it definitely influenced people. And you know, real life has also influenced horror as well. Or there's been movies based off real events or loosely inspired by them. The Exorcist, for example, I think was based off a supposed event. The Conjuring series, The Haunting, you know, all those were based off events that were claimed to be real. It's the same with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Well, it's not entirely based on real life, it was loosely inspired. And it's the same thing with The Strangers, you know, and there's definitely more that I'm probably missing out on. But of course, how could horror influence media? Well, it's done it before. I mean, you have horror movies, you know, you've had horror games. I mean, you had, the Resident Evil series, which has done generally extremely well in regards for what it uh, was. It started off as a survival horror series and quickly evolved into horror action, or both. And it's done pretty well. Then you have stuff like Silent Hill, which seems to be more psychological. Then you have stuff like Aoni or White Day, which is, more RPG Maker or survival horror. And, you know, and I think one of the things that does work well with horror is limited exposure. So this is referring to, like, oh, in the first Halloween, you don't really see much of Michael. You know, in the sequels you do see more of him, but in that first movie you don't really see much of him, which makes it work well. And it's the same thing with the first Jaws movie. You don't see much of the shark, which makes it, when the shark does come, a bit more scary. And it's the same thing with Leatherface. In the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you don't really see him much, and that makes it, when the characters encounter him, that much more scarier. And so I feel limiting where the viewer or player sees these monsters makes it work a bit better. Like, I think what really works with White Day is that you can't really fight against the janitor or other monsters. You're kind of screwed, so you gotta run. The game limiting what you can do works well, and it's also the same thing, in the reverse. Sometimes when you introduce the monster earlier, it can work. Aoni, the monster is introduced pretty early on, and the rest of the game you're just trying to avoid it. Or Resident Evil 2 or 3, Mr. X and Nemesis are introduced early, at least in the remakes. And it works well because you know this monster is going after you and you have to avoid it. There's no fighting it, but you're just gonna have to avoid it for now, and it works pretty well. Same thing with Nosferatu or Frankenstein. The monster is introduced early in those, and it generally worked well for it. Sometimes the monster can be revealed too early, which does drag it down, but that's besides the point. So I guess, what are other ways horror has influenced games? I mean, you have stuff like The Last of Us, which does focus on like an aftermath. It's not focusing on like what's happening now, but focuses on what happened afterwards. This deals with a infection, a fungus infection, and it does pretty well. While you do fight zombies in that game, it's set way after the outbreak happened, not like Resident Evil where the outbreak is happening, and it does really well in that regard. So of course, and there's been other ways that horror has influenced media too. We've seen horror in movies, and I think, and I generally think horror has influenced movies in quite a great way, because you have stuff like Nosferatu, or you know, um, I guess what could be next? Yeah, you have stuff like Nosferatu or Lost Boys, or Halloween, and these are all completely different movies, but they work well because they do different kinds of horror. You know, they're both, you know, horror movies that deal with, you know, supernatural elements, and, in regards, Nosferatu and Lost Boys are about vampires, but are focusing on, a different kind of vampire, and I think it generally does extremely well. And it's, really, and it's honestly really good in my opinion. And of course, you know, then we have literature. I think this is generally one of the more interesting parts of horror because this seems more personal. I mean, books like The Shining, you know, um, Gothic Tales of Terror, and a bunch of, other books that just might contain one story, might just contain several, really touch on the topic of horror and do them really good. And, it's definitely something to appreciate. There's several books about just all kinds of stuff. You got books about, you know, about fictional serial killers or aliens or monsters or zombies, but or ghosts or demons. Personally, I find stories about demons to be really creepy, but fascinating too. And sometimes even it's the same from real life. Well, this isn't really horror. Real life is also kind of a scary thing too, because there's some unsolved mysteries that have happened, and it really bridges the gap between fiction and reality at times. And you know, so the whole point is that horror itself can be done in many good ways, and you know, it's a very interesting and influential genre, and it's one of my favorites. Be it in books, TV, movies, or games, or even music. I mean, there's been plenty of musicians who have used horror elements as a driving force in the music, you know? But that's all I really have to say for today's video. I will hopefully try to make more of these on this channel. There's no promises on this yet, it, because worst comes to worst, they might just be lumped in with the Moth Queen stuff. But that's all I really have for today. So, of course, thank you all for watching and have a wonderful day. I've been Belle, your host, and I hope you all stay safe.